Good morning.
Good
I'm
morning.
happy to welcome Dr. Berenson from the Russia Institute of the King's College in London. Thank you for being here with us today. ICAR is interviewing leading international experts in order to understand what is going on in Russia and Ukraine at the moment. One of Dr. Berenson's most interests is the relationship between citizens and the state in Russia and Ukraine. Well, you could as well gain plenty of direct experience in Eastern Europe, working for and advising different organizations, such as Freedom House and the World Bank in Russia. Well, I would like to ask you a few questions. We all know Ukraine is being invaded. The information is changing at, well, every hour. And already many Western governments have condemned this war. But how effective are the sanctions the EU and the UK have agreed on? How far are they ready to go against Russia?
So the sanctions initially were set out as to be a deterrent to prevent Putin and Russia from invading into Ukraine. Obviously, they were not successful. They did not deter Putin from making that decision to go in. At the same time, a number of sanctions have come on board. There are debates within, I would say broadly, the Western alliance within NATO and the European Union as to what additional sanctions will be undertaken. There have been news reports within the last 24 hours that the sort of nuclear option, so to speak, of sanctions, which is the booting Russia out of the SWIFT financial system, is gaining support from even allies within the EU that previously had thought not to be in favor for it. Doesn't mean it's going to happen immediately, but it's certainly an option that is now very much on the table. Additional sanctions have been piled on, most recently from Western states with respect to Putin himself and to his foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Those, to some extent, are more symbolic, I would imagine, because the wealth that Putin himself has is most likely hidden in the West and under the names of different oligarchs or friends rather than in his own name. So it's not something that could immediately be located. And it may be something that, quite frankly, Putin does not care about. This is obviously from his message to the world the other night and in front of his Security Council at the beginning of the week, illustrate that conquering and incorporating Ukraine back into Russia is very deeply felt within him and is very much part of his core. There are additional measures considering being taken. Within the last night, I believe the 27 nations agreed to provide military aid to Ukraine. These can also do substantial amount of support. Of course, the details are not there as to what particular type of military aid and how fast it would be given to the Ukrainians, but certainly the Ukrainians have the ability to fight back. They have a strong will. This is their homeland. They have the advantage there, but certainly they will be needing additional military and armaments to fight back. The final, perhaps the most immediate thing that could be done to help Kiev, which is facing a Russian sort of onslaught from the north, as well as the country as a whole, would be for the NATO allies to declare a no-fly zone over Ukraine. That would be able to kick out the Russian fighter jets that are trying to bomb the country from above and give the Ukrainians on the ground a better chance. That is something that has been suggested. It doesn't mean that NATO or the allies would get involved in a ground war or fight directly against Russian troops, but the superior air force or as I've been told, the Air Force of the UK and the US is superior to that of the Russians, such that they could effectively maintain a no-fly zone over the country and sort of delay the onslaught onto Ukraine and give the Ukrainians a fighting chance.
Well, thank you. And do you think there is a difference between the roles the EU, the UK, and the United States could play in this?
I think that it's not clear exactly, in my mind at least, it may be certainly clear in the policymakers' minds, as to why, what is the exact reason that NATO forces have not supplied more weapons before the invasion and have not been willing to go into Ukrainian territory to assist the fight. Of course, there are multiple reasons that can be offered, whether they be the fear of engaging with another nuclear power, fear of having a NATO versus Russia war or combat, or whether it's just simply about not wanting to tell domestic audiences back home, whether it be in the US, the UK, or other EU countries, that they're sending troops in, and some troops may not come home for this cause. And one wonders, Putin has been very successful in the past 22 years of his reign. When he has had military combat, he's always won. And he's always won because the West has not put up a fight definitively to deter him. And I'm afraid that the only way to have prevented this would have been to have a more forceful military presence in Ukraine. Certainly, Ukraine was integrating into the West economically, financially, as well as socially, but Ukraine did not have enough of a security sort of architecture that would also provide for its sort of like a canopy over its development in other areas.
Well, concerning the security architecture, many commentators have spoken about a turning point in recent European history. How will this war change the security architecture in Europe, as well in regards to roles of the EU and NATO in the future?
Well, there are a couple of things. An immediate effect is that we now have frontline states that have more of a hostile border with Russia along the Baltics, Poland, Romania, that we didn't see before. Certainly, some of those states actually do, almost all of them do border Russia. But I think that they immediately feel the presence of Russia closer in to them, and they are going to feel greater insecurity, which will require NATO to beef up its presence in those NATO allied countries. And that's exactly what NATO is doing. In the longer run, there are questions about, this goes back to even the 2014 crisis, where the EU tried to provide for an agreement with Ukraine. And that's what in part sparked Putin's advancement on Crimea and on the Donbas region of Ukraine. And there will have to be some consideration in the West and around the world as to whether politically, economically, socially, we can strive to integrate countries into the West without providing them with the sufficient security architecture canopy over that to enable them to flourish for the long term and to truly integrate with us. The steps taken between 2014 and 2022 will be very much looked over and questioned, and the West will need to provide a concrete formula as to how to integrate and how to take steps towards integration of other countries, whether it be in the EU or in the globalized free world of democracies. And that has to be given consideration. Ukraine is very much at the heart of Europe. It's the largest country entirely in Europe. It's larger than France. It's the size of the state of Texas in the US, but has a much greater population. Obviously, the European part of Russia is larger, but as in terms of Ukraine has always been desirable, principally because in terms of when we think about geopolitical considerations across the European continent over the last 100 years, because it is the doorstep to Central Europe. And many believe that conquering Central Europe, having Central Europe in one's hands, so to speak, would enable one to basically control Europe. So this is something that allies across Central Europe very much have to consider, and very much probably know about far more than I do about their own histories and why there have been battles on their lands in the past century. Moreover, when speaking of NATO, there are states that will consider whether they should be more firmly part of NATO. That might include Sweden, Finland, and Austria being more integrated into NATO. That's obviously, these are decisions for the mid-range, for those countries to take on their own as to how they will integrate with greater security alliances. And the bottom line is NATO firmly has much more of a purpose today because of Putin than it did several weeks back. And that's going to be very attractive. The world's largest security alliance in history will be very attractive to those remaining states in Europe that are not part of it.
Well, going to war is not only costly in humanitarian terms, it is as well incredibly expensive and requires a lot of logistics and resources. Do you think Russia can economically afford this war?
Obviously, Putin thinks it can. They have in the short term acquired a huge amount of foreign currency reserves and money which to do this. It's very critical for Putin to make some sort of alliance, however firm or not, with China, because the goods that Russia was selling the world, namely energy, will have to be bought by China for Russia to be able to continue to finance the war. I don't think that Putin is concerned overly with the living standards of his own people. That's not been the motivating factor for a lot of things over the last 22 years. He certainly has been trying to keep the population within Russia satisfied. But if it slips a little bit for Russians, I don't think that's a firm sort of concern about the Kremlin now that they have launched this big adventure into Ukraine. But if Russia cannot sell its goods, its products, its oil and gas, and then certainly in the medium to long run, it cannot sustain not necessarily the war itself, it's the occupation of Ukraine that's going to be the most challenging. I'm not clear to what extent Putin really understood Ukraine before Thursday. And I'm sort of amazed at it. In my own work, I've talked about how different Ukraine is from Russia itself. The populations, the political culture are very different. And that means the relationship to power and to the state has been very different between Russia and Russians and Ukrainians in the sort of greater abstract. Russians are been much more afraid to stand up to power. Ukrainians have a weaker authority, but they're much more willing to stand up to that authority. They have throughout their history. They have little fear of the state and little trust of the state. And I don't see why that less fear and less trust would not be transferred to an occupying Russian power, such that I think it's going to be very, very costly for Russia, not just to win the war, but to actually successfully occupy and incorporate Ukraine into Russia. That, for the long term, is just not going to work. Ukrainians are not Russians, and I go into that in my book, Taxes and Trust.
Thank you. So you've mentioned China. how dependent is Russia really on the West? Could, for example, China replace lost trade and investment?
So Russia is dependent upon the West in terms of having a buyer for its oil and gas at the moment. And there are many countries within Europe. One example is Germany, that is very reliant upon oil and gas. 40% or more of Russia, of Germany's energy needs come from Russia at the moment. At the same time, there are, of course, other industries. Luxury goods have been, the luxury goods industry, be it in Italy or France and other places around the EU, have been really supported to some extent by their sales to wealthy Russian oligarchs and elites. And that's why a swift ban will really affect domestic industries in some countries more than others, because of the goods that they have sold to Russia and continue to sell to Russia. In the medium to long run, there's obviously a push to get Germany and other countries within Europe less dependent upon Russian energy. I do believe that will go forward. It may not be immediate. There's efforts to ramp up the distribution of liquid natural gas, LNG, such that places like the US or countries in the Middle East can provide Germany and other European countries with gas. It will be more costly, of course, than the prices that Germany has negotiated with Russia in the past. But I think that the Germans recognize the importance of this issue, and they will come to recognize the need to wean themselves off of Russian energy.
Well, definitely this crisis is affecting the Russian economy. So do you think there will be conflicts between the government and the private sector in Russia?
I think that there already have been some sizable protests across Russia in the last 2 days, which dramatically shows that the population is not entirely behind the Kremlin on this. Further, the population that has been sort of split in Russia in terms of their support for invading Ukraine. Polls taken just immediately before the invasion showed that it was almost a near 50-50 split. And those Russians who are for invading have been doing so perhaps out of fatigue, not wanting to hear about the Ukraine crisis anymore, or perhaps out of some sort of fatalism. And that could change. These are not fixed numbers. They could change either way. When it comes to private enterprise, I would imagine the closer the private economic sphere is to the Kremlin and reliant upon ties and to the Russian government, they may be initially more reluctant to speak up, but in the long run, I don't see that support being solid. This regime has become, in the Kremlin, has become very repressive, very coercive. It was from the beginning, the way the Putin regime started with the war on Chechnya, and literally from then the disregard for local life. But the regime has become much more coercive in the last couple of years, and that understandably provides for some fear in individuals to speak up to power, to speak up to a state that has been successfully coercive up to this point. And we saw sort of visual evidence in the Security Council meeting at the beginning of the week that Putin had with his ministers and advisors, in which they were, in some ways, some of them were reluctant to state firmly that Ukraine should be invaded and attacked.
Well, thank you very much for answering all my questions and for sharing your interesting insights with us. So this is everything from my side. Do you wish to add any additional point or?
Sure. I mean, I will say that for multiple reasons, the Ukraine cause should be the world's cause and should be the EU's and NATO's cause. Now, how that manifests itself in terms of how specifically the EU and the NATO supported is obviously a matter for speculation and debate. And we've seen a lot of support, but there are real critical issues here that are at stake for the international world order. First of all, for the United Nations, for the international legal system, it's founded on the principle of sovereignty of individual states. As the Kenya ambassador said to the UN earlier in the week, many countries around the world have borders that were artificially created, but we have to deal with it and prosper within those borders, not wreck or tackle those borders. Moreover, Ukraine in 1994 had the third largest cache of nuclear weapons in the world. And they decided on their own, with support from outside, to give up those weapons in exchange for not a treaty, but an agreement called the Budapest Memorandum, where the UK, the United States, and Russia would honor the borders of Ukraine. I cannot foresee any country in the world in the future being willing to give up nuclear weapons after this, unless there's strong support to make sure that Ukraine stays as a sovereign state. What country in the world, despite global concerns about nuclear proliferation, what country would give up their weapons after seeing what has happened in the last 48 hours? And that should not be allowed to stand. And finally, there's a deeper moral cause, I think, that the West needs, the world needs to be supporting Ukraine. Over the last 100 years, Ukraine suffered perhaps the greatest loss of life of any other territory on the globe, beginning with not just World War I, but in the Holodomor or Stalin-imposed famine on Ukraine in the 30s, the Stalin's purges across the Soviet Union in the mid to late 30s, the World War II, which saw Ukraine being attacked not just by German forces, but more Jews were killed on Ukrainian soil during the Holocaust by bullets than were killed in Auschwitz. We have an obligation to recognize this is a land that has suffered a lot, adding to it Chernobyl and what had happened in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbass. This is a country that has experienced suffering like no other. And they have become a tolerant people within their own country, but we have an obligation to make sure that they are able to succeed and thrive from this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Berenson.
Thank you. My pleasure.